me a second to allow Peter in. My name is Michael. I'm going to kind of kick us off, and I'll be handing this to other people who are on the security team panel here to answer questions as we move along. So we are the Drupal Security Team. We are volunteers from around the world. The Drupal Security Team is a team of individuals. We come from pretty much everywhere and from pretty much different backgrounds. We are all technically volunteers on the team. However, some of our employers pay us to spend time working on the team, but the Drupal project itself does not pay us compensation to do this type of work. And so I'm interested to know, about everybody in the room. And obviously, if we were in person, we might walk around and say hi to people, shake hands. We can't do that. So what are your name and your pronouns if you're comfortable sharing them? What is your favorite type of ice cream? And when it is safe to do so, what is the first thing that you're going to do that you've been unable to do? And let's try to keep this under 10 words. I'm not going to take the time to read this out, but I will read them and may comment on them after I'm done getting through these slides. So what does the security team do? We triage reported security issues. We help the process of fixing security issues move through our processes. We coordinate with other open source security teams. We do a lot of this, significantly more since Drupal 8 and 9 and soon 10. XJM will be talking about that later on. We keep track of trends around hacked sites, and we handle community education similar to what we're doing now. What don't we do? We don't actually proactively fix vulnerabilities. This is somewhat of a misnomer that the security team actively is running around trying to find security holes in people's modules. We don't do that. We don't also help fix hacked sites. So we might provide some general high-level guidance if there's a lot of sites that get compromised in a similar manner. But overall, we don't actually fix individually hacked sites. And we don't proactively review maintainers' code. We have a workflow vulnerability. And so what the security team mostly does, the core work of the security team, is following this type of chart, where we find out about our vulnerability, it gets reported to the security team in some manner or some form. The team validates that there's an actual vulnerability. If it's not, we inform the person who reported to us that it's not valid or that it could be public. Sometimes vulnerabilities are security in nature, but we don't need to fix them through our private process. If it is an actual vulnerability, we go through this process to release what we eventually call a security advisory, which comes out on Wednesdays. Wednesdays, I have a very nice slide here. We do releases on Wednesdays around 4 p.m. UTC. That's noonish in Eastern time. The third Wednesday of every month is kind of special because that's when we do with security core releases. I'm sorry about that. And the goal of this is to provide people with the time of when we're going to actually perform the release so that they can be ready to update their sites. You can follow the security team and hear about mostly the releases on Twitter, via email, or in Drupal Slack. Security team gets involved with some of the other programs that are surrounding the Drupal ecosystem. Drupal 7 Extended Support, which I'll talk about in a second, Drupal Steward, and the Automatic Updates Initiative, which there are tons of sessions on later this week. And at the end, I've got actually a slide showing all those sessions. So Drupal 7 end of life. If you haven't heard and you run Drupal 7 will no longer be supported by the security team, the volunteer security team, on November 28th, 2022. At that point, all Drupal 7 releases on project pages will be flagged as not supported, and we will no longer handle the reporting of Drupal 7 specific issues. It's best practice not to use unsupported software on your sites. It would not be advisable to continue building new Drupal 7 sites new Drupal 7 sites today. You should start planning your migration to Drupal 9. After November 2022, if you've got third-party security scans, they may show up as that you're running insecure software in them. And we did change this from November 2021 to November 2022 in June, I think, last year, maybe earlier than June. I don't know. Time due to COVID all has somewhat compressed. There are some folks out there, some sites, some enterprises that can't migrate in this time frame. They've got a large amount of custom code or custom workflow around that. And just like with Drupal 6, we have put together what we're calling the Drupal 7 Extended Support vendor platform. And so we've got some vendors that are available who can help you maintain your site running Drupal 7. These vendors will get access to some of the security team's tools, and they will have a release process similar to what we're doing now for Drupal 6. And yes, there are still some Drupal 6 sites remaining out there. And so that is the Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 Extended Support Program. We're going to move into kind of what a vulnerability is. Like, we as a security team spend our time defending against vulnerabilities, helping patch vulnerabilities, and so it makes sense to identify what a vulnerability is. Vulnerability is effectively some form of a weakness that an attacker can leverage in some manner. We get asked, what is security? You know, it's a really meta question. There isn't a great answer for this. There's a lot of good answers, but I don't think there's like a perfect answer. But the normal standard answer that I've seen is the CIA triad. CIA does not refer to a government agency in the US. CIA is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that's one of the ways that we measure the security of a system. Peter, do you want to talk about did we lose Peter?
We might have.
Okay. Well, there's Peter.
I got him.
Hello, Peter, just in time. Do you want to talk about the different types of vulnerabilities?
I'll try, but yeah, I had to reload a couple times because I'm not seeing the slides advance. I'm not sure if that's happening for other people. Anyway,
Advancing the slides?
I am advancing the slides.
Okay, yeah, we've only seen security team Q&A the whole time, so I was a little worried about that too.
Yeah,
so
yeah, like
I don't see any slides.
When I reload the page, it goes to a new slide, but otherwise it's not advancing.
Yes.
Ted says he's seeing it advance, so maybe it's just me.
Yeah, Hopin has done that in the past, so yeah, reload if you suspect you're not seeing them.
Yeah, well, I
If you're not
reloaded
seeing the
twice.
slides advance, please reload your browser, and I will try to, while Peter is talking, get a link to publicly share the slides.
Okay, anyway, so different types of vulnerabilities. I'll just talk about these real quick, and hopefully Michael can advance these, and I'll look at my other copy of the slides. So there are obviously a ton of different types of vulnerabilities. Kind of your starting point for understanding the range of these is probably the OWASP top 10. So this is kind of a consensus list about the vulnerabilities that are both the most common and the most critical for web applications. And really that top 10 list is intended to be a baseline. Like, you and everyone at your organization who's a developer should be familiar with that. You should read through it, kind of think through those things when you might have seen them. These OWASP top 10 is actually updated every few years based on kind of a survey of the community to see what is actually happening out in the wild, what vulnerabilities are currently most important. So the 2017 version is the most recent version, and I think there's a link there. And then if we go to the next list, so we don't have time to dive into all of these. There is great information on the OWASP site about each one of these and kind of what it means. But I wanted to just briefly mention some of them that you've probably heard of in the Drupal context, because they're kind of the ones that we see probably most often and that are most severe. So OWASP top 10, number 1, injection, is on the next slide, the most severe possible vulnerability that you can have in your site. It's things like SQL injection or remote code execution, basically where the attacker can have the potential to essentially take over your entire web application, potentially your entire server. These are, the most severe vulnerabilities we've seen in Drupal, the 2014, for example, SQL injection, where anyone basically could take over a Drupal site just by sending certain crafted queries. And a more recent one with a form API that also allowed code injection. So those are extremely bad if you have that, and especially if it's accessible to anonymous users. That's the worst possible thing that can happen to you. The next is also very bad and probably much more common. So injection is the worst, but not a common vulnerability. But problems with authentication are surprisingly common. You'd think that was a pretty basic thing, but even to the level of allowing your users to reuse passwords or allowing them to use very weak passwords, a few letters, and especially for administrators of your site, not implementing some kind of two-factor authentication. Drupal does a great job on the last 2 points, but homegrown web applications don't, in terms of storing passwords securely, right? You've heard about people getting their passwords leaked from like Adobe and other major providers that had web applications, or not properly generating session IDs, which can basically allow attackers to hijack your session from before and after you're logged in. Next example, broken access control. This is something we do see some version of pretty commonly in Drupal. So an example is some sensitive data being exposed because node access tags are not applied correctly, or let's say a permission check is not applied correctly. Things you see out in the broader world are access bypass. When people design their web applications poorly and they, let's say, provide the user a link to their own profile, but they don't check that the user, whether the user is trying to access someone else's profile. So someone who's just very moderately clever can go and change the ID and the URL and access any other user's profile. This is a surprisingly common bug that's seen like in things like credit card sites. You would think they would know better, but you should always check for this kind of thing, and especially your own web applications or just for fun of others. And then another common kind of broken access control is allowing someone to update data when they're only supposed to be able to view it. So like, again, a custom API on the back end, not Drupal, where there are not permissions properly checked to see that someone has edit access. And then a final example I'll talk about is the most common probably vulnerability we've seen in Drupal over the course of Drupal's life, which is cross-site scripting. This is where there's some kind of JavaScript injected into the page by an attacker. The classic example was printing the node title without sanitizing it. And this is, usually requires a little more effort, maybe allows, but can happen, for example, if anonymous users can post comments on your site, you could have this kind of vulnerability. An administrator views the page, then the attacker script executes and basically acts as the administrator to do things like changing user passwords, creating new user accounts, adding roles. So basically anything that you in the browser can do, this cross-site scripting attack can do. And so it is extremely dangerous, definitely more targeted, but not something you should ignore. So yeah, you should definitely go back and look at the OWASP Top 10. If you're not familiar with it, this is, as I said, really a baseline of something you should be familiar with as a developer, and everyone in your organization should be familiar with.
So code has vulnerabilities in it. We know that code has vulnerabilities in it. Probably the best way to find vulnerabilities in code is to go through and read the code line by line, understand the code, have someone peer review your code. Depending on the amount of code you have, maybe you've inherited your site, that is a very time-consuming process. And it can be hard to, get the resources to do that. And so there's been a lot of progress recently in trying to find ways to automate that process. And so we're going to turn this over to Sam, who's not here. Okay, we're going to turn this over to Sam, and I'm going to be Sam's slides for a second to talk about a tool that he has worked on to automate this process. And so, hi, I'm not actually Sam. Oh, wait, there's Sam.
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. Sam.
Wow, that's amazing. So yeah, I can do this. Sorry about that.
Awesome.
I've refreshed so many times, and I eventually unplugged everything and plugged it back in, and that actually worked, except you can't see my face, but I'm not touching anything now. So Yeah, we can move. I can't see the slides. Are you on the first slide? I can just follow along in another browser.
Hi, I'm Sam.
Okay, one sec. I just have to open the slides separately. This is fun. Great. I'm Sam. I'm on the Drupal security team. I'm a security researcher and obviously a person that fixes stuff. I think I just kept this slide in because it's fun, and it also shows that I have found a lot of bugs. So we can move to the next slide. Yeah, I'm going to talk quickly about SAST. So SAST is also known as Static Application Security Testing. Basically, it's just a way to find security bugs automatically. So in your CI/CD and like a cron job on some random server, you have something that's looking at your code and trying to find if you're introducing new security vulnerabilities. And this can be anything. It could be like a grep that you wrote that greps for like eval, and if that happens, it breaks the CI build. It can go all the way to actually evaluating the code, like executing it. It can construct an abstract syntax tree. It can do all sorts of stuff. So it encompasses a lot of things. Some of them use taint analysis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And usually these tools are really noisy, which kind of makes them hard to use. They give a lot of false positives. So we can move to the next slide. There are a few existing security tools in Drupal or around Drupal. One is SonarQube, which is one of the few good freemium or open source SaaS tools. A lot of people just use it for CI/CD, but it also does, or for code quality, but it also does security checking. And then there's a lot of enterprise SaaS tools. There's too many to name, but they've always been there. And if you want to pay a lot of money, you can have those too. For just Drupal, there's the coder module, which we could have been using for like 10 years. It's been around a long time. This does like basic checking of best practices in your code, including security checks. There's also PHP CS, which has some Drupal security rules, but I think it's mostly for checking like classic PHP issues like unserialize or some eval or shell exec and stuff like that. Few, if any of these, actually perform taint analysis for free. SonarQube does, but you have to pay. So a lot of times this is like a gated feature. So we're going to talk about it if you want to move to the next slide. Taint analysis is basically the process of evaluating your code, probably with an abstract syntax tree, which is basically a machine readable version of your code, whereas like the normal code is kind of more human readable. So what it does is it looks at taint sources, which is basically a source of untrusted input. So this could be everything from, you can see on the screen, a get parameter, post parameter. It could be stored, but also user controlled. Like a node title could be a taint source because those are configurable by users. And it traces those all the way down into what's called a Taint Sync. And basically a sync is something dangerous. So in Drupal, we know in this left code example, you're passing a get parameter, which is called query, all the way down into the database. And this could be any query. I mean, you can look at this and be like, wow, that's terrible. But this sort of stuff does happen. And why I'm talking about it is most of the tools that don't do taint analysis can't check this, especially when we're talking about tracking user input from one file all the way into another file through all these processes and different variable names. You can't do that with just regex. You can try it, but you probably can't. So this is why taint analysis is really cool. So you can go to the next slide. So yeah, so one tool for PHP that does this and does it really well is called SOM. SOM is a Sass scanner that Vimeo wrote for their site. I guess they use a lot of PHP. I'm not really familiar with it. SOM started out as just being something more like TypeScript for PHP. You could annotate all of your classes and variables, and it would do like type checking, just like TypeScript does with JavaScript. But then they added taint analysis and got more into security. So this is really, really cool. And even without the Drupal support, it already had a lot of Symfony support. So I looked at this and I thought, let's actually add Drupal support. So if you go to the next slide, trying to be under the 5 minutes. So what I created is an integration between SOM and Drupal. So what's cool about this is that it's very Drupal aware. It knows about your forms, your controllers. It can handle render arrays, which is to the rest of the PHP community, a crazy Drupal monster that no one understands. So it took a lot of work to get that added. It auto-generates entry points for you, which I won't go into too much detail, but basically taint analysis checkers need to know where the code flow starts. Sadly, our web apps are way more complicated than just hitting a PHP file and then rendering output. Now we have autoloaders and crazy indirect references for everything, but it tries to generate these entry points automatically. And with what's there right now, it should be able to find most cross-site scripting and SQL injection using the Drupal APIs. There's probably a lot more it can do, but that's what it can do right now. So yeah, it's open source and open for contribution. If you go to the next slide, I'll finish up. So yeah, use it. It's open source. The link there is at the bottom. I think for people writing custom code especially, this is a great thing to throw in your CI job and just check new code for issues. And you may find it's stuff in existing code too. It is Drupal 8, 9, and I'm sure 10 only. So you'll have to upgrade your Drupal 7 site if you want to make use of it, but I think it can be really good. If you find anything that's kind of questionable or weird, just PM me in Slack or file a public issue, but don't file a public issue for 0 day or something. Make sure you kind of obfuscate what the problem is, and I'll try to help you out. So that's it for me. Thanks.
So I do this slide series at every security presentation that I give, at least. And the takeaway from this is security isn't this one-time thing you have to do. It has to be part of your process. We brush our teeth, at least hopefully, every day. It is a task that I hope that everybody does every day. Most of us probably do it twice a day. And we do this because the long-term problems from not brushing our teeth every day are really expensive and potentially very painful to clean up. And so security is the same way. You can't dedicate, your 1 month every other year to your security problems. You really have to get it into your development cycle and as part of your process. So, one of the ways that Sam just indicated is CI/CD that does some type of automated builds, code review time set aside for it. There's a lot of other presentations out there on what are some of the best practices, what can you do, but the big ones are build time into your processes for security and make sure you're always running something that's updated. The security team is releasing things on Wednesday. If we release something, make some time to upgrade it. Be running the most current version of the software. Now, for some folks, that actually becomes, quite difficult. Some folks have, enterprise gates on when they can release and deploy software. Some folks don't have the staffing required to do releases on Wednesday. And to that, I'd like to talk briefly about a new service that's being offered by the Drupal Security Team and the Drupal Association, and that is Drupal Steward. Drupal Steward is a web application firewall that protects sites from known vulnerabilities before the vulnerability is disclosed and the update is released. It buys you some time between when that email gets published or that tweet or that message in Slack, however you find out about security issues, when that message gets published on Wednesday to the time you have to patch your site. And so for highly critical issues, well, the last time we had one, I remember waiting in Slack and there were people there and it was, a lot of people around waiting in Slack for that to be released. And they were all there because as soon as it got released, they needed to test it and deploy it on their site quickly so they didn't get compromised. To get around that, Drupal Steward helps with this. Drupal Steward has some limitations. It only applies to highly critical vulnerabilities in core that might expand in the future. And there are some types of vulnerabilities that can't be protected using a WAF rule. How it works? Well, using a real example here, security team has identified a vulnerability and we've flagged it as highly critical and mass exploitable. We figure out what that ID is, and we determine whether or not the vulnerability can be mitigated with some type of web application firewall rule. We determine that it can in this instance, and we issue our PSA, which is part of our process generally when doing a highly critical release. And we will indicate right in the PSA whether or not the vulnerability will be covered by Drupal Steward. Okay, now the slides aren't advancing for me. So we put it right in that PSA so that people are aware of it. Then WAF rules are communicated to our partners, and we put them in a monitor-only mode that lets us detect false positives. And so everything's enabled. We monitor the rules to make some refinements to them. We don't want to break sites when we release this. That's why they're in monitor-only mode for now. And then right prior to the release, the WAF rules are switched to an enforcing mode, mitigating the vulnerability. Now, this is not a free service. It takes some decent work to run the infrastructure for this. And there are kind of 3 different ways of our pricing for this. We have a community tier for low traffic and nonprofit sites, the standard tier, and then our enterprise tier. And our enterprise tier goes through our enterprise platform, and for the standard tier, we have different ways of going through and selling that. The community pricing, to give you an example, it's $15 a month per domain name. That includes 10,000 requests per month. And if you need more requests, that's billed out at 10 cents. Why isn't it free? Like, that's an awesome question. This is an open source community. Why aren't we giving it away for free? Mostly because there's an infrastructure here to run it. It's a service. It requires a WAF provider. There's bandwidth costs associated with it. But that's not to say the patch, what we've always released in the past is free and will always be free. And why can't we just share the WAF rules? Typically, the WAF rules give you an exact path to exploit the vulnerability. And so with a mass exploit vulnerability, we want to delay the time between our release and when attackers start exploiting those sites to give folks time to upgrade their sites. And so that's why we can't just share the WAF rules. As I indicated before, there are 2 sets of limitations with this. It is available for highly critical core vulnerabilities, and there are some vulnerabilities that we can't protect using a WAF rule. So if you're interested, either as a customer or as a partner for selling this, please schedule a time with Tim Hestenetz. And here is his link, and I will drop that in the chat at the end of this. So, this goes to the kind of the background of releasing things. And there's all these mechanics that happen in the releasing things. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, let's take this patch, let's commit it to core, and let's just, fire off a release. So I'd like to turn this over to Jess, XJM, to talk about kind of the thoughts that go into releasing and dependencies. And so, Jess.
So as Michael said, I'm better known as XJM on Drupal.org. I am part of a team of about a dozen Drupal core committers who can review and commit everyone else's core patches, or now in the new and exciting modern day, merge requests. We're the only ones who can accept changes into the core project. It's a small team. Within that team, I'm one of the 2 active release managers for Drupal 8 and above. And the release managers are responsible for actually tagging the Drupal releases you can install on your sites each month, as well as setting schedules, evaluating the potential changes, and so on. I've helped coordinate all of the security and minor releases we've had for Drupal 8 and 9 to date, and I've personally rolled probably most of the security releases myself. So when your Drupal site says security update required, you can probably think of that as me saying hi to you. I work for Acquia, and I'm part of the awesome Drupal acceleration team there. So back in the day, Drupal didn't really have external dependencies other than jQuery. But in 2015, we released Drupal 8, which was basically a complete refactoring of the Drupal that had come before. And Drupal 8 and 9 rely on a number of external composer dependencies, including Symfony, Twig, a few Laminas framework libraries, among other things. And the diagram at the right there is a little old. I didn't get a chance to update this. This is Drupal 8.7.0's composer dependencies. I do have a new diagram of Drupal 9.1's, but I forgot to put it in the slides. As you can see, there's a lot of different dependencies involved. This is for Drupal core itself, not including any other contributed modules that you might install, which would have their own dependencies. Any installation profile you install will have many more dependencies. But that's, it's a worthwhile illustration to get an idea at least of, what's inside Drupal and what we rely on as part of our code base for core. I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide. An important fact that I don't think a lot of people realize is that this coordination with other open source projects, in order to improve Drupal's code has some impacts on the amount of work the security team does. So among all of the Drupal 8 and 9 security releases we've created to date, 1 and 3 have involved our upstream dependencies in some way. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the dependencies are any less secure than Drupal core. Theoretically, all other things being equal, we'd have the same number of vulnerabilities, even if we were the ones maintaining that code instead of the other open source projects. But it does have an impact on how we schedule and ship releases. When we have a vulnerability in our own code, we can review and test the fix ourselves in advance of disclosure. We can bundle multiple security fixes in a single release so that site owners don't have to apply so many security updates. Next slide here. So now I'm going to share a little story here of a problem that we ran into as a result of coordinating with our upstream dependencies and the sort of things that we have to take into account not only when we create security releases, but when we schedule the release cycle for Drupal 9 and 10 and releases going forward, when we make decisions about what dependencies we are going to add to core, and that will affect things like the automatic updates initiative, which I invite you all to come to our auto updates initiative day, keynote, Q&A, and so forth on Thursday. I'm involved in that initiative as well. These factors with dependencies have a big impact on decisions we've made for auto updates as well. So as of Drupal 8.0.0 back in 2015, PHP 7 hadn't actually even been released yet. So Drupal core supported PHP 5.5 and 5.6, and we made our best efforts to be forward compatible with PHP 7. Next slide. In July of 2016, though, PHP ended its official security coverage for PHP 5.5. However, throughout 2016 and into 2017, nearly 20% of all PHP websites on the internet were still using PHP 5.5, even though PHP itself was no longer releasing security patches for us. Now, keep in mind that distros providing their own security patches for PHP versions, and indeed that are using like their long-term support releases, like if you use one of the Ubuntu Unimals 10.04 type releases, those releases provide security patches for the PHP versions for years afterwards. And PHP 5.5 was used by Trusty Tar, which actually had security coverage all the way until April of 2019, a couple years ago. So well after the time frame that we're talking about here. However, a site using that stack, using Trusty Tar, might reasonably have expected their PHP 5.5 applications to keep working. At the same time, though, in 2016 and 2017, many new releases of other Composer packages started dropping support for PHP 5.5 and began to even require PHP 7. Go ahead to the next slide. So early in 2018, we announced that we would require PHP 7 ourselves in Drupal, starting with Drupal 8.7, and that came out 2 years ago in May of 2019. Now, there was a big risk for us in supporting PHP 5 so long after the official end of life by PHP, because it meant that we had an increasing number of dependencies that were on older versions. We were weighing that against the risk of denying 20% of all sites, that 20% of sites still using PHP 5.5, any security updates at all. Because if you create a release of Drupal that has a minimum requirement of PHP 5.5, you can't install anything. So it's like, do we care that their PHP is out of date, or do we care that they can't install a critical security update for Drupal? Go ahead, next slide there. So in the summer of 2018, months after we made our announcement already about dropping support for PHP 5.5 and 5.6 in May of 2019, we received a report of a URL rewrite and cache poisoning vulnerability that the researcher planned to disclose in August of that year. A colleague of mine researched the report and found that the vulnerable code was present both in Symfony and in several Zen framework libraries, including ZenFeed and Diactyros, which are both used by Drupal core. So we collaborated with the security teams of all three projects, as well as the researcher who reported it, to find a disclosure date that would work for everyone, and we came up with August 1st. So Drupal planned for a security release for it, labeled as SA Core 2018-05. But there was a problem. Next slide. Very late in the process, like the day that we were releasing the security release, I discovered that Zen Framework had actually also already dropped support for PHP 5.5 from those two libraries in minor releases earlier in the year, despite that 20% of PHP sites were still using it at the time. So we couldn't update Drupal to require the secure versions from the release we helped coordinate, because we didn't meet their PHP version requirements for the new versions of those two packages. Now, fortunately, it turned out that Drupal core itself was only vulnerable because of Symfony. We weren't exercising the vulnerable code in the Zen framework libraries at all. It was still a near miss, and we still, for several months after that, and technically, I think probably until the release of Drupal 9, were required to support minimum versions of these libraries that weren't compatible with Drupal, certainly until May of 2019, because even though it didn't affect core, but if someone else were using those libraries and we were required to use these older versions, they would have had the vulnerabilities if they happened to use the same code. So it's kind of a big problem. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I've run down a few worst case scenarios about what might have happened in the situation if it hadn't only been because of those dependencies, if core itself had been vulnerable because of this. So if we'd actually been using the vulnerable Zen code, we couldn't just drop support for PHP 5.5 during a security window, right? That would have caused mass chaos and panic. Would we have tried at the last minute to convince maintainers of an upstream project to make a release contrary to their release policies? Would we have forked or overridden the library's vulnerable code and scrambled to backport their patches to an unsupported version we were using? And then what if that backport had taken days or weeks? And then what would that mean for updating the library in the future? Even when we did eventually stop supporting PHP 5.5 and 5.6 in 2019, there were still a lot of complaints about it. At that point, it had been multiple years since PHP didn't support PHP 5.5, and I believe the better part of like a year and a half or so until they stopped supporting 5.6, but there was just a lot of people in the community pressed back on it and were concerned about the fact that we'd dropped support for PHP versions during a major release, because that meant they had to make changes to their hosting to upgrade the PHP version and so forth. Risk-averse sectors of Drupal's ecosystem, like the government, education, and finance, vastly prefer LTSs. And so for all of our users, they prefer having the schedule, announced more in advance like that. So we simply couldn't sustain making new major releases every time of Drupal, like every time PHP dropped support for a version, which is, they drop support now every year for one of the minor versions that they have. So, and then go ahead and the next slide. What we concluded is that we have to set each Drupal major version's PHP requirement as high as possible. This means that the PHP version requirement for Drupal 9, I believe, is 7.3, and which was we almost wanted to do 7.4, but 7.3 was the most we could get away with at the time. And it also means that Drupal 10's PHP version requirement will be, if not 8.1. And I would say that I would love to see PHP extend coverage for PHP 7.4 a bit beyond just the 1 year that they've offered for it, and to be a little bit more sympathetic. That way, we wouldn't have this extra year of LTS for Drupal 9 where we support PHP versions that are end of life, which again puts us all in the same situation where what if a dependency decides to drop support for PHP 7.4 when Drupal 9.4 is sitting out the last of its LTS days, something bad could happen again in the future in that situation. But this is about the best we've come to so far. So as you can see, it's complicated. This is just one of the many sets of really complicated factors that go into decisions around how and when we release security fixes for things, the amount of work the security team does, and the decisions we make for the release schedule and for the automatic updates initiative. And that's about all I got. Sure thing.
So this is a Q&A panel. I would like to solicit questions. We've got some in chat that I'm going to go over quickly, but if you've got others, please feel free to throw them in chat or in the Q&A section. The Q&A section may be easier, but either is fine. Can someone speak to modules that are not supported by the security team, and what decisions go into that? So at the moment, the process to get your module supported by the security team is a peer review process. It is not perfect. It has some flaws associated to it, but that is the current process. There's also, I'm not quite sure what's meant by not supported here. There's also the unsupported module process, which happens when a supported module has a security issue in it and the maintainer doesn't actually fix the problem. And so, if we go back to our very early diagram of this process that we follow, and Chrome is not agreeing with me today. In the process itself, there we go. In the process, if the maintainer is not responsive to security issues, we will actually give a set amount of time. It's typically 2 weeks, then followed by another 2 weeks. And then there's actually normally a third 2-week warning on it. So it's, a month and a half at minimum. And we will mark the module unsupported or unmaintained because there's a known security issue in it. And then one of the other questions on here is the EU recently passed a law requiring 10-year support for electronics. As the world looks into similar laws, do you foresee Drupal security covering versions for a longer amount of time? So I'm assuming this is related to Drupal 7 end-of-lifing. Drew, do you want to take that? And I'm calling on you without warning, so if you're not available to take it, I can answer it.
I can. I mean, from the point of view of Drupal 7, by the time the end of life comes in November 2022, the Drupal security team will have supported it for just over, for 11 years or so. So from that point of view, Drupal 7, yes, has had that, will have had that coverage for that long. For the 8 and 9 and later versions, I don't think the support will be as long for each individual release, which Jess could speak to perhaps.
So
Jess.
For Drupal 8 and beyond, one important change, one thing that's very, very different than the Drupal 7 situation, is that all the changes and refactorings we did in Drupal 8, following the fact that there was no database upgrade path, it always required a migration, there was no easy way to update APIs, we completely changed the way that we do major releases. If you haven't had the opportunity to try a Drupal 8 to 9 update yet, I recommend first of all doing that soon if you do have a Drupal 8 site, as we're running about 6 months left of support for Drupal 8. And I think you'll find it, for those who have completed, we've gotten so much feedback that it's just so much easier than it ever was in any previous release. In a lot of ways, we've adopted what we call the continuous upgrade path, and so that means that even though so Drupal 8's end of life date is at the end of 2021, it was released in 2015. That was about a 6-year life for Drupal 8. Drupal 9's is going to have to be a lot shorter because of the version of Symfony we're using. We don't have a choice about that unless Symfony decides to add another 7 years of support to Symfony 4, which, so it depends a lot on our dependencies. But in some ways, depending on how you interpret this, again, the upgrade from Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 is going to be super easy. It's easy for module developers. There are now automated tools that make the changes required and submit patches in the contributed projects queues. Right now, I would say the biggest barrier is actually just getting maintainers to commit the patches that have already been made for them. And a vast majority of, it's been less than a year since Drupal 9.0 came out, but still the vast majority of the top 100, top 500 modules and so forth already have at least like an alpha or beta, if not a stable release available that works with Drupal 9. And one of the things we're going to do during the sprint later in the week on Friday for the Drupal 10 Readiness Initiative is actually kind of going to do sort of a module maintainer drive, look for queues where the patches that were already provided haven't been committed, try to get in touch with the maintainers and see if they'd be open to adding a co-maintainer who can make the changes to the module, review and test it and so forth, to make the module ready for Drupal 9 and then eventually Drupal 10. So from that perspective, it's sort of more of a, it'll be interesting to see how any of this gets applied to software rather than, physical hard electronics hardware. But I think that we're in a situation where an argument could be made that, Drupal 8 is continuously supported with small, updates required every few years going forward. But yeah, we're right now the release dates that we set for our major versions are completely, which are the only versions that have backwards compatibility bits, completely controlled by our dependencies. So where goeth Symfony, so there shall we. Symfony and a number of other projects like CK Editor has a pretty big impact on our timeline right now too.
Thank you, Jess. So a question from the chat: if two different Drupal sites have the same configurations, for example, content types, are there any security concerns if both sites use the same configuration UUIDs? Sam or Damien, do either of you want to take that?
Yeah. Let me just read it. No, I don't think anything explicit. I mean, you want to watch out if you're doing something like config sync between two Drupal sites that might have like some conflict in UUIDs. I'm sure that is not good. But yeah, otherwise, no, I can't think of any explicit security issue. It's more like a availability issue. So.
Philosophical conversations about this before we released the new configuration system. I don't think we ever came to a clear answer on whether or not that would be problematic.
Do we have any other questions before I start asking questions?
A few in the Q&A tab that haven't been answered yet, right?
Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Okay. Let's see. We have a site that has a data center in the US. The majority of customers are from the US and a few from the UK. UK customer doesn't want the data to leave the country. I'm not sure that's necessarily a security issue, and it sounds more of a policy issue, but I don't have a lot of experience in dealing with the European Union's data protection laws. But I do know there's a decent number of providers that do have data centers that are in regionally located areas. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Okay.
I just say for GDPR, talk to like an expert or a lawyer, because you just don't want to, you don't want to end up on the bad end of that. So.
Yeah, that's actually a valid point. We've spent a lot of time talking about the technical side of security, but there's also the policy side. And we haven't gotten a lot into like the policies that are surrounding security, because this is more of a technically focused session. But I agree with Sam here that sounds like it's a question for a GDPR expert and or a lawyer, or a comment or a consideration with your hosting company. Are there any considerations for major versions of Drupal for the DA or anyone else to do penetration and or major security testing of Drupal itself? I don't know if there's any specific plans for that. We do often host, what's the word I'm looking for? Bug bounty programs? Yeah. Where we effectively fund a pot of money for people to find security issues in Drupal and then pay them based on the severity of it. Typically that comes from a donation process where we get the pot of money and then we partner with a vendor who doesn't charge us the typical fees on top of it to manage the program. These are great because we get, every time we've done one of these, we get a few major issues out of them. The problem with them is there's an enormous amount of signal to noise ratio. And so going through that process gets us a lot of noise that has to be filtered through, but they are valuable when we do them. It's a good idea. We should probably check into seeing if we can get a pot of money to do that around the release of Drupal 10.
10 might because we didn't do this due to Drupal 9 for Drupal 9 specifically. The last time we did like a huge bug bounty against all of core was around the Drupal 8 release, I think. I mean, there have been other shorter bounties since, but not something around, not something with a significant investment. But on the other hand, the timeline for the release of Drupal 10 is very short. And so it's not something we will block the release of Drupal 10 on. If funds should become available to do a bug bounty either before or after release, I'm sure that we'd be excited to collaborate with stakeholders to make it happen. But and then to the question of pen testing, I don't know if someone else wanted to respond to that, but pen testing is even more notorious for getting false positives. So I think we'd want to choose the partner for doing that really carefully. It's a lot.
And that links up to one of the questions in the chat about third-party security audit services. There are third-party security audit services that are really, really good, but if they have not worked with Drupal before, I would steer away from them. There's a lot of things that if they're just running automated scanners on and providing you a report, then they're going to find a lot of false positives. And so, I would be more interested in the methods they're using to do this. Are they manually going through and running things? If they run an automated report, do they validate by hand? That type of thought processes around this. Drupal Steward can be resold. The process for that is to go make an appointment with the link in the slide, which I will put in the, actually, Neo, can you drop that in the chat? Do you mind? Because I assume you can find it faster than I can at this point. But Drupal Steward can be resold. There is a partner program for it. It can be resold at 2 different levels. It can be resold on your infrastructure, or you can resell the base offering from the Drupal Association, and there's a different pricing tier, obviously, if you're reselling it. Here's a good question. Are we making changes for Node.js libraries that are part of the Decoupled menu initiative?
I would love to answer that question. So the answer is yes, we are making changes. The security team itself is not making specific changes to its processes, but we, with the help of Gibbs Sulis, former coworker of mine, a number of the JavaScript maintainers and contributors, we actually spent some time writing out a formal RFC to document everything around how Core's NPM published JavaScript packages would work, including documenting security expectations for them. So there's this set of new JavaScript packages that are being published to NPM that are officially considered part of Drupal core, including, so far we have the once library, which is a backend dependency of Drupal that we refactored out. It used to be on GitHub, written by an individual Drupal contributor. Going forward, it's been modernized now and is available as an NPM package that then Drupal depends on. And it's considered part of core. It's subject to all of the same security team process and expectations that a core package would be. The Drupal security team is the contact for the package on NPM. So if security issues are reported that route, they come through to us, and then we can use our normal security tooling to handle and discuss them. And yeah, we've set expectations around how long a package needs to be supported after its release if a new major version of the package comes out with a new major version of Drupal, how long security fixes have to be issued for it. All sorts of things like that are very well defined in an RFC document. I can probably share in the chat when I'm done talking. But yeah, we've mostly taken the process we had, added an account on npm.js. I always forget the real URL. But yep, all those packages are treated as part of core, and we've made accommodations to use our existing security team infrastructure and process while providing what JavaScript developers will need. One of the things is it does say in the RFC that the JavaScript packages should not include any production dependencies. So there's an effort to, if at all possible, unless it cannot justifiably be annoyed, not add upstream dependencies to the JavaScript packages that we release as part of core in order to avoid the left pad low dash 17,000 npm package dependency problem security tangle that a lot of the ecosystem gets into. And we have yet to come up with a library where it was necessary to add a production dependency. And the first time that becomes necessary, it'll be discussed pretty thoroughly with the JavaScript maintainers, and we'll figure out exactly what we want to do. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So I'm being told I've got a 5-minute warning here. I want to spend 1 second and just show some slides that are, or I'm not slides, some sessions that are coming up, except, yes, that are related to automatic updates and or security. And so this is the list of things that I will at least be attending. Obviously, you know, you can go through the schedule and find your own list, but these are the ones I'm going to highlight here. And the last question I think we'll take: with PHP projects, Git server hacked to add backdoors to PHP source code last month. As was reported by the media, PHP maintainers have decided to migrate the official PHP source code to GitHub instead of running their own Git repo. What is the Drupal project's thinking on this? Are you thinking of a similar move? So as Drew just indicated, we've actually moved off of our custom implementation of Git into GitLab. So we are running the self-hosted and GitLab, which is basically the packages produced by GitLab themselves. Neil, do you want to address this in any more detail?
Yeah, the type of vulnerabilities that at least the PHP team has reported, those should not affect us. It's been a while since we've had a Sql injection bug with our stack. And yeah, we're running an instance of GitLab. We keep it updated as quickly as possible. And they have a whole security team fixing all of the issues they find.
So thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this session. Please remember to fill out the evaluations, and we will be around on Slack and the rest of the conference. If anybody has any further questions, I am more than happy to answer questions directly or have one-on-one meetings, etc. Everybody have a great rest of your DrupalCon.